So, Netflix's Daredevil series has been out for a while now, and the consensus is people genuinely seem to like it, and it wouldn't be a Marvel project if it didn't come with Easter eggs. So join me, why don't you, while I go deep into all the different comic tidbits that makes Daredevil such a special little program.
So let's get this Easter egg hunt off right by looking into the very first episode. A young Matt Murdock loses his sight pretty much exactly like he did in the comics, pushing a bystander out of the way and getting his eyes splashed with volatile chemicals. Now I know we have more than a few Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle fans out there, who'll of course waste no time telling you that Daredevil and the whole ninja themes going on there were a major inspiration for the Turtles. And fans, myself included, love to think that the same ooze that blinded Matt Murdock also sank down into the sewers and gave birth to the Turtles as we know them, but now we're totally mixing universes. Next up we have the priest that Matt Murdock is having confession with, Father Lantom. Now I did not catch this on my first go around, but turns out this guy actually is a minor character from Marvel Comics. He's actually related to the Runaways in Cloak and Dagger, if you can believe it. Now when we first see Daredevil in the show, he's taken down a human trafficking ring that's being overseen by none other than Turk. Turk is a long-standing Daredevil character, and he is in the comics pretty much how he is here in the show. A low-life scum-sucking punk who exists only to get beaten up by Daredevil for information. As a matter of fact, there was a point in the comics when Turk put on a supervillain suit and attempted to try and be a bad guy himself. Yeah, it did not go well for him. And while I'm sure you're all probably pretty damn sick of hearing it by now, I would be remiss if I did not mention that the black suit in which Daredevil is wearing here is of course yet another reference to the comic and the black sweatsuit costume that he wore during Frank Miller's Man Without Fear story. Now, all throughout the 13 episodes of Daredevil, they make reference to the incident, the New York incident, which is of course the Chitauri invasion that we saw in the Avengers. It's because of this Hell's Kitchen is in the middle of a giant reconstruction effort, and with construction comes a lot of money, and with a lot of money there will undoubtedly be crime, and it seems that all the villains in the show want a little piece of that. Now, one of the early fan favorites was of course James Wesley, and he too is a character from the comics, just a really minor one from the Miller-Mazzucchelli years. He appeared in the story Born Again, and was pretty much in the show as he was in the comic, being the Kingpin's loyal toady, but not nearly as interesting as how the show makes him out to be. Speaking of crime and the Kingpin, and I most certainly was, the show makes numerous references to a Mr. Rigoletta, an old mob boss, basically the Kingpin before the Kingpin. Now, in the comics, Fisk worked for this guy as a bodyguard, would end up killing him and then assuming pretty much all of his territory and influence. It's clear that's very much what happened in the show, too. The Kingpin, of course, isn't the only classic Marvel baddie we've got to look forward to in Daredevil. There's, of course, Leland Owlsley, aka the Owl, although, then again, maybe he's not, maybe it's his son who he's often referencing, who's the real Owl. Nobu, who as we find out later is more than just a Yakuza guy, he's actually connected to the Hand, a clan of evil ninjas, who, yes indeed, don their classic red garbs for this show as well. Then there's the mysterious Madame Gao, who stamps all of her drugs with a dragon that looks suspiciously like Iron Fist dragon, or even more so like Iron Fist's villain Steel Serpent symbol. This old lady also seems to know Kung Fu herself and claims to be from a place even further away than China. Could this lady be from Kunlun? Could this be a lead into the Iron Fist show? Well, your guess is as good as mine at this point. In episode 2, we're introduced to Claire Temple. She's the nurse who's nice enough to patch up Matt Murdock after he shows up almost half dead. Now, in the comics, Claire was married to Bill Foster, a character who would take up the Giant Man persona for a little bit, and also had a relationship with Luke Cage, so don't be surprised if she's your lead into the Luke Cage show. Now, for the first little bit, Matt actually talks to her in the guise of Mike, an assumed name which is actually a super mega in-joke. You see, for a little bit in the comics, Matt Murdock actually pretended to be Mike, his twin brother who could see. Yeah, I know, it's super weird. Now, in a flashback, we see Jack Murdock getting pressured into throwing his fights by a Roscoe Sweeney. In the comics, he went by the name The Fixer, a supervillainous moniker because, well, you know, he fixed fights. The guy next to him is called Silk, which is almost certainly a reference to Sammy Silk, a slimy mobster that gave Daredevil trouble in the Bendis Daredevil run. Another Easter egg we can find at the gym, which has already been talked to death, is Murdock's fight with Crusher Creo, who we all, of course, know will become the Absorbing Man, and who was already seen in an episode of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Now in episode 3, we actually get a pretty good look at the church that Matt Murdock frequents, St. Angie's. St. Angie's was also mentioned as the orphanage that Agent Skye from Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. grew up in. Does this mean that her and Matt have some sort of connection? That would be interesting. The church and Father Lantom is also kind of important because, as comic readers would know, Matt Murdock's missing mother ran off and became a nun. This episode also introduced us to Ben Urich. Now, Urich is a major fixture within the Marvel Universe, not just in Daredevil, but in Spider-Man and even in Civil War, too. I should also note that he has a nephew who also just so happens to be a journalist and who had quite a few run-ins with the Goblins. Urich works for the New York Bulletin, and as we can see behind him in numerous shots, he wrote stories about the Avengers fight with the Chitauri as well as the Hulk tearing up Harlem. Now, in episode 4, Urich talks about looking into Karen Page's past, and apparently what he finds is not all that flattering. Keep in mind that in the Daredevil story Born Again, which I had mentioned previously, Karen Page fell in with drugs, drug dealers, porn, and eventually ended up selling out Matt Murdock for another hit. Is it possible that her rough life has already happened by the time she met Matt and Foggy? It's something to think about. Now, in episode 5, we get a great scene between the Kingpin and Vanessa at dinner wherein she jokes about a prince who once tried to pick her up wearing a white suit and an ascot. This is funny because that's pretty much the Kingpin's costume from the comics. Kingpin would eventually don a white outfit at the end of the season, but it would not be in the way you think it would be. Now, in episode 7, FYI, my favorite episode, we are introduced to Scott Glenn as Stick, Matt Murdock's Ninja Master. What's interesting about this is that the series takes a lot of reference from Man Without Fear, and in that story, Stick actually taught Matt Murdock to harness his abilities while his father was still alive. It's in this episode, too, when Stick asks the people at the church about Matt's mother, he doesn't get a straight answer, so it's clear people know, they're just not telling. In this very same episode, while hunting down Black Sky, our heroes come across a shipping container that reads Asano Robotics, as in Yoshida Asano, a D-list Iron Man villain who went by the name Samurai Steel. No, that's not related to Silver Samurai. It's at the end of this episode, in a panel that seems to almost be torn right out of the Man Without Fear, Stick goes to meet Stone, as we can tell because he's a big buff dude with a bunch of stuff on his back. These guys are all part of the same group of warriors called the Chase. They basically exist to checkmate the hand for when they get too powerful or step out of line. And they all just so happen to have one-word names like Stick, Stone, and Shaft. It's in episode 8 we get our first look at Melvin Potter, who in the comics was a supervillain who went by the name the Gladiator. His workshop alone is filled with dozens of Easter eggs, like the fact that he's messing around with saw blades being his weapon of choice in the comics. Later, when Matt breaks in, we see the actual symbol of the Gladiator costume in the background. And even later on, we see stilts in the background, no doubt a reference to the famous D-list Daredevil villain, the Stilt Man. Now, in episode 10, we get our first big reference to Elektra, Foggy talking about a Greek student that Matt had a crush on. Nobu also mentioned a lady assassin earlier on, so it's safe to assume that Elektra's out there doing the job of killing people already. It's in a flashback to Matt and Foggy's intern days that we get a case involving Roxxon Oil. Roxxon has already made dozens of appearances all throughout the MCU, from Iron Man to Agent Carter. And you just know it wouldn't be a list of Marvel Easter eggs if we didn't mention Stan Lee. He actually does show up in Daredevil, but it's a blink and you'll miss it moment as a picture behind one of the cops at the police station.
So, those were the Easter eggs I managed to find. I'm sure I missed more than a few. Down in the comments section below, tell me your favorite Easter egg, or that if you caught any that I didn't. Thanks for watching, everybody.
Hey guys, Joel here reminding you that this video was made possible thanks to our many great patrons. If you want to become a patron and get exclusive comic book cast content, then click the Patreon link below and see how you can help us bring you the content you've come to love. Every little bit helps, and thanks for listening.